Define Black health and wellness in America as the death of your father at 8 years of age from tuberculosis. Define tuberculosis as a disease contracted from efficient chemicals, quickly developed and hastily tested and introduced to farmers and the general public without much concern for long-term consequences. Define tuberculosis as a bacterial infection resulting from long-term exposure to DDT. DDT, a chemical that had been used in World War II to kill insects that carried malaria and typhus, and was introduced to American farming and farming technological systems in the 1950s. Define death as poverty. Define death as labor. Define death as the result of a lack of access to health care. Define tuberculosis as a disease which kills 50% of those individuals untreated. Define death as the studies had not yet been done. Define health and wellness in America as it depends on what color you are. Define Black health and wellness in America as poverty, death, and labor. Define Black health and wellness in America under farm labor as the total expenditures of pesticides and the fact of their tenfold increase between 1945 and 1972. Define Black health and wellness in America under farm labor as although total pesticide production was below 100 million pounds in 1945, it jumped to about 300 million pounds by 1950, and it jumped again by 1960 to over 600 million pounds. Define Black health and wellness in America as the death of your father at 8 years of age. Define the death of your father as the fact that in 1952, 11% of the corn and 5% of the cotton acres in America were treated with herbicides, but by 1982, these percentages had risen to 95% of the corn and 93% of the cotton. Define the death of your father at 8 years of age as the difference between 5% and 93%. Define death as the registration of over 10,000 new separate pesticide products between 1947 and 1952. Define tuberculosis as a disease caused by poverty. Define tuberculosis as a disease fostered by the Black experience in the United States. Define tuberculosis in terms of its relationship to systemic and systematic racial injustice in America. Define tuberculosis in relation to the history of slavery, agriculture, economy, industry, technology, and the economics of exploitation under capitalism. Define DDT in the same manner. Define Black health and wellness in America as the death of your mother at 16 from a heart attack. Define heart attack as the emotional consequence of the loss of one's husband. Define heart attack as the physical and emotional consequence of a lack of minimal economic resources. Define heart attack as the labor required to raise a family alone as a single Black mother in the 1950s. Define heart attack as one in a long list of potential consequences of farm labor. Define heart attack as part of the history and economics of African American labor in the United States. Define heart attack as the legacy of slavery. Define heart attack as systemic racism in America. Define Black health and wellness in America as dying at 54 from cancer. In spite of attaining significant economic resources, having the means and opportunity to treat that cancer. Define Black health and wellness in America as dying at age 54 of cancer. Because as a child, you contracted pathogens. Because as a child, there were pathogens in the fields in which you picked cotton. Because as a child, you were exploited. Not by your parents trying to survive, but by the technologies and industries under which you labored. Because as a child, you were exploited by poverty itself. By the technologies and chemicals produced by industries, including insecticides and herbicides and fertilizers as well. Define poverty as labor. Define poverty as loss. Define poverty as inaccess to health care. Define poverty as the past. Define poverty as the past that persists in the present. Define poverty as the inescapable and unavoidable destruction of health and well-being. Define poverty as the studies had not been done yet. Define poverty as a day spent fertilizing the cotton fields with nitrogen pellets. That you gathered together in an old coffee can and tossed out over the field. Define poverty as a day spent inhaling the dust of those little nitrogen pellets. The ones that left traces of a bacterial infection in your father's lungs. Define poverty as the memory of one's father, your father, only before 8 years of age. Define poverty as the memory of your mother only before reaching 16 years of age. Define poverty as the limits of memory but do not define poverty as the limits of love.